I thought I would talk today about the joy of children's books. Reading children's books has shaped my life, and I don't mean the books I read as a child. I mean the children's books I've read as an adult. I began seriously reading children's books in my 20s, many years after I'd stopped reading them as a child. I was working as a bartender and a waitress in New York City in the early 1980s. I'd arranged to work at night so my days could be free for reading, study, and scribbling poetry. I also liked to draw, so I enrolled in a children's book illustration class at the New School. The first time I shared my drawings with the class, everyone laughed. The only problem was I hadn't meant them to be funny, so I never went back. But while I was trying to illustrate, I discovered the Children's Book Council, which at that time was on Gramercy Park, and I started making visits there on winter afternoons. As I sat in the small, quiet library and looked at picture books, I stopped focusing on the illustrations, and I got captured by the writing. I read wonderful stories by Arnold Lobel and Kenneth Graham, William Steig, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Beatrix Potter, Maurice Sendak, Margaret Wise Brown, James Marshall. In the writings of these authors and many others, the ordinary details of life were made fresh and new. In Owl at Home, Owl decides to make tear-water tea. He thinks of everything that makes him sad. Chairs with broken legs, pencils too short for use, spoons fallen behind the stove, beautiful mornings that people have slept through. Lobel constantly made the ordinary seem extraordinary. And so did Laura Ingalls Wilder. In her books, household things, food and nature often stand out as beautifully as they do in A Still Life by Chardin, or Landscape by George Ennis. In The Long Winter, Laura Ingalls Wilder writes, "At supper time, the light shone through the clear glass onto the red check tablecloth, and the white biscuits, the warmed-up potatoes, and the platter of fried salt pork." In Farmer Boy, she writes, "The air was as still as ice, and the twigs were snapping in the cold. A gray light came from the snow, but shadows were gathered in the woods." Long ago, as I read these descriptions and others in books like them, the world around me became more alive. I hungered to name things, to pay more attention to the sound of rain and the slant of sunlight. I began collecting nature books, field guides to wildflowers, trees, birds, insects. I bought a red box and started keeping file cards. I was a person who had waited all my life for a reason to keep file cards. Now I kept one with categories such as color, light, food, weather. I looked in the red box the other day for the first time in a long time and found cards that said things like black-capped chickadees, weeping cherry trees, hot dog suppers, and gospel singers. By choosing the right details, colors, and odors, we can, in the words of French writer Jean Giano, quote, "dilate the pores of time, and we can enter time like an oil." I love the character details in all the children's books I read. In Wind in the Willows, I loved Mole's brown little face with whiskers and his wire baskets with ferns and the statuary in his garden of heroes of Italy. And the description of Toad Hall as a self-contained gentleman's residence, dating in part from the 14th century with up-to-date sanitation and 5 minutes from church, post office, and golf links. In Ginger and Pickles, Beatrix Potter tells the story of a cat and dog shopkeepers. Ginger asks Pickles to serve the mice that come into the shop because they make his mouth water. "I cannot bear," he says, "to see them going out the door carrying their little parcels." Pickles says, "I have the same feeling about rats, but it would never do to eat our customers." The first thing I did with my first royalty check was go into Books of Wonder, which was in the village at that time, and buy the complete set of the Little Beatrix Potter books. They were $90, and at that time, that was a big chunk of my first royalty check. But I also read wonderful stories and novels such as Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, The Island of the Blue Dolphins, British Terabithia, Sarah Plain and Tall. I saw the huge range of possibilities of how to tell stories with depth and humor. In Charlotte's Web, E.B.'s White, quote, "Some pig" was akin to a Zen revelation for me. And when Stuart Little's girlfriend appears in, quote, "sports clothes" and is only 2 inches high, I felt as if the world had been turned upside down. In The Hobbit, Tolkien's description of the Hobbit's home is something I read and reread. It, quote, "was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. It had lots and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbits were fond of visitors." And the funny thing I realized when I was writing this is that every time I'm out of town almost, I buy another, either The Fellowship of the Ring or The Hobbit. And I'll often find myself in a hotel room rereading the description of the Hobbits' homes as if that were my home. And I realize I get homesick for the Hobbits' homes more than I... Don't tell anyone. In my 30s, I discovered the magic of fairy tales and folk tales, and the walls of my imagination opened further. With The Little Boy in Hans Christian Andersen's Tale of the Snow Queen, I, quote, "flew over woods and over lakes, over sea and over land. Beneath them the cold wind whistled, the wolves howled, the snow glittered, and the black crow flew cawing over the plain." I visited the sea garden of The Little Mermaid, quote, "full of fiery red and dark blue trees, whose fruit glittered like gold." I read all the old tales of Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, and I buried myself in books of Greek mythology where, quote, "the Titans were the first children of Mother Earth. They were the first gods, taller than the mountains she created to serve them as thrones." In Norse mythology, I love the beginning of the Norse myths. And anyone who retells them, as I also did later, will quote this beautiful passage taken from almost 1,000-year-old text. Quote, "Early in the morning of time," go back to that, early in the morning of time, there was no sand, no grass, no lapping wave. There was no earth, no sun, no moon, no stars. There was a waste of frozen fog and a place of raging flames. Inspired by all those tales I read, I over the years retold at least 9 books of fairy tales, American tall tales, and Greek mythology. And those works continue to feed me all the time. In fact, children's stories, ancient and new, have been a vital replenishing force in my adult life because they speak to something ineffable. That something is referred to by Stephen Minchell when he discusses the work of the poet Rilke. Quote, "the taste of an apple, a horse galloping across a meadow, a flower opening at dawn, all are so intensely present in their ephemeral beauty that outer turns into inner, sense into spirit." C.S. Lewis describes reading Beatrix Potter's Squirrel Nutkin as a seminal experience as a child, for it gave him the idea of autumn, which kindled a feeling of intense desire, a sense of, quote, "something quite different from ordinary life, and even from ordinary pleasure, something, as they would now say, in another dimension." Lewis expands on that idea in a book he wrote later called The Weight of Glory. Quote, "the books or the music in which we thought the music was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing, for they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." For me, that magical longing that Lewis talks about is stimulated by children's literature.